alternative offered to the sufferers. With sickening anguish the first morsels were prepared and given to Lemuel Murphy. But for him they were too late. Not one touched flesh of kindred body. Nor was there need of restraining hand or warning voice to gauge the small quantity which safety prescribed to break the fast of the starving. Death would have been preferable to that awful meal, had relentless fate not said, "Take, eat that ye may live, eat lest ye go mad and leave your work undone." All but the Indians obeyed the mandate, and were strengthened and reconciled to prepare the remaining flesh to sustain them a few days longer on their journey. Hitherto the wanderers had been guided partly by the fitful sun, partly by Lewis and Salvador, the Indians who had come with Stanton from Sutter's Fort. In the morning, however, when they were ready to leave that spot which was thereafter known as the Camp of Death, Salvador, who could speak a little English, insisted that he and Lewis were lost, and therefore unable to guide them farther. Nevertheless, the party at once set out and traveled instinctively until evening. The following morning they wrapped pieces of blanket around their cracked and swollen feet, and again struggled onward until late in the afternoon, when they encamped on a high ridge. There they saw beyond, in the distance, a wide plain which they believed to be the Sacramento Valley. This imaginary glimpse of distant lowland gave them a peaceful sleep. The entire day of December 31st was spent in crossing a cañon, and every footstep left its trace of blood in the snow. When they next encamped, Mr. Eddy saw that poor Jay Fosdick was failing, and he begged him to summon up all his courage and energy in order to reach the promised land, now so near. They were again without food, and William Foster, whose mind had become imbalanced by the long fast, was ready to kill Mrs. McCutchen or Miss Graves. Mr. Eddy confronted and intimidated the crazed sufferer, who next threatened the Indian guides, and would have carried out his threat then, had Mr. Eddy not secretly warned them against danger and urged them to flee. But nothing could save the Indians from Foster's insane passion later, when he found them on the trail in an unconscious and dying condition. January 1st, 1847, was, to the little band of 8, a day of less distressing trials. Its members resumed travel early, braced by unswerving will power. They stopped at midday and revived strength by eating the toasted strings of their snowshoes. Mr. Eddy also ate his worn-out moccasins, and all felt a renewal of hope upon seeing before them an easier grade which led to night camp where the snow was only 6 feet in depth. Soothed by a milder temperature, they resumed their march earlier next morning and descended to where the snow was but 3 feet deep. There they built their campfire, and slightly crisped the leather of a pair of old boots and a pair of shoes which constituted their evening meal, and was the last of their effects available as food. An extraordinary effort on the 3rd day of the new year brought them to bare ground between patches of snow. They were still astray among the western foothills of the Sierras, and sat by a fire under an oak tree all night, enduring hunger that was almost maddening. Jay Fosdick was sinking rapidly, and Mr. Eddy resolved to take the gun and steal away from camp at dawn. But his conscience smote him, and he finally gave the others a hint of his intention of going in search of game, and of not returning unless successful. Not a moving creature nor a creeping thing had crossed the trail on their journey thither, but the open country before them, and minor marks well known to hunters, had caught Mr. Eddy's eye and strengthened his determination. Mrs. Pike, in dread and fear of the result, threw her arms about Mr. Eddy's neck and implored him not to leave them, and the others mingled their entreaties and protestations with hers. In silence he took his gun to go alone. Then Mary Graves declared that she would keep up with him, and without heeding further opposition the two set out. A short distance from camp they stopped at a place where a deer had recently lain. With a thrill of emotion too intense for words, with a prayer in his heart too fervent for utterance, Mr. Eddy turned his tearful eyes toward Mary and saw her weeping like a child. A moment later, that man and that woman who had once said that they knew not how to pray were kneeling beside that newly found track, pleading in broken accents to the Giver of all life for a manifestation of His power to save their starving band. Long restrained tears were still streaming down the cheeks of both, and soothing their anxious hearts as they arose to go in pursuit of the deer. J.Q. Thornton says, "They had not proceeded far before they saw a large buck about 80 yards distant. Mr. Eddy raised his rifle and for some time tried to bring it to bear upon the deer, but such was his extreme weakness that he could not. He breathed a little, changed his manner of holding the gun, and made another effort. Again his weakness prevented him from being able to hold upon it. He heard a low, suppressed sobbing behind him, and turning around, saw Mary Graves weeping in great agitation, her head bowed, and her hands upon her face. Alarmed lest she should cause the deer to run, Mr. Eddy begged her to be quiet, which she was, after exclaiming, "Oh, I am afraid you will not kill it." He brought the gun to his face the third time, and elevated the muzzle above the deer, let it descend until he saw the animal through the sight, when the rifle cracked. Mary immediately wept aloud, exclaiming, "Oh, merciful God, you have missed it!" Mr. Eddy assured her that he had not, that the rifle was upon it the moment of firing, and that, in addition to this, the animal had dropped its tail between its legs, which this animal always does when wounded. His belief was speedily confirmed. The deer ran a short distance, then fell, and the two eager watchers hastened to it as fast as their weakened condition would allow. Mr. Eddy cut the throat of the expiring beast with his pocket knife, and he and his companion knelt down and drank the warm blood that flowed from the wound. The excitement of getting that blessed food and the strength it imparted produced a helpful reaction, and enabled them to sit down in peace to rest a while before attempting to roll their treasure to the tree near by, where they built a fire and prepared the entrails. Mr. Eddy fired several shots after dark, so that the others might know that he had not abandoned them. Meanwhile, Mr. and Mrs. Foster, Mrs. McCutchen, and Mrs. Pike had moved forward and made their camp halfway between Mr. Eddy's new one and that of the previous night. Mr. Fosdick, however, being too weak to rise, remained at the first camp. His devoted wife pillowed his head upon her lap and prayed that death would call them away together. Mr. Thornton continues: "The sufferer had heard the crack of Mr. Eddy's rifle at the time he killed the deer, and said, feebly, 'There, Eddy has killed a deer. Now, if I can only get to him, I shall live.' But in the stillness of that cold, dark night, J. Fosdick's spirit fled alone. His wife wrapped their only blanket about his body, and lay down on the ground beside him, hoping to freeze to death. The morning dawned bright, the sun came out, and the lone widow rose, kissed the face of her dead, and, with a small bundle in her hand, started to join Mr. Eddy. She passed a hunger-crazed man on the way from the middle camp, going to hers, and her heart grew sick, for she knew that her loved one's body would not be spared for burial rites. She found Mr. Eddy drying his deer meat before the fire, and later saw him divide it so that each of his companions in the camps should have an equal share. The 7 survivors, each with his portion of venison, resumed travel on the 6th, and continued in the foothills a number of days, crawling up the ascents, sliding down the steeps, often harassed by fears of becoming lost near the goal, yet unaware that they were astray.